Hey, and welcome to this module of the titration video series. What we're going to be discussing now is my favorite part of titration, which is enforcing policy. So we've gone through the policy lifecycle. We've worked through building up application dependency maps. We've worked through analyzing those policies and testing those policies. Really, the last thing that we need to do is actually go and click the button to enforce those policies on the application workloads. So how about we get to it?
Yeah. By the way, I guess you're Tim and I'm Remi, right?
Are you sure? I'm Remi, you're Tim?
I'm not sure, you decide.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we need to enforce two workspaces. Workspaces are enforced on a workspace basis because they hold different policies and they apply to different parts of the scope tree.
Wait, you already asked me, why two workspaces? Why do we have to enforce two?
So we've been looking at the fact that there are global policies and there are individual application-specific policies.
Okay.
So the global policies being things like you should access DNS servers, you should be allowed to access the Active Directory servers, and those kind of policies I want to make sure are loaded on every single workload, no matter what type of individual application policies I'm going to apply.
Oh, okay. So in our environment, we need two, maybe a customer, we need 3, 10, or 1.
Yeah. And it always makes sense to get the global policies, the static policies, those that are going to apply to every single workload, enabled first, so that when you go and apply those specific individual application policies, you're not missing any of the infrastructure rules.
I see. So basically, you don't shoot yourself in the foot on things like DNS, SSH, RDP on Windows.
Those kind of basic things that you might want to ensure that the workload has access to always.
Okay.
Now, it's interesting that you actually mentioned that term, shooting yourself in the foot. It's something that we've thought about before, and it's something that's actually very hard to do, or at least to completely blow your foot off in titration.
I feel much better. I can have half a foot.
So what we do is we make sure that no matter what policy you push down to that workload, no matter even if you permit or deny any, I should say, there will always be a back channel to the titration cluster. There is no way to completely lock yourself out of the system.
Oh, is that the concept of golden rules?
That is what we call a golden rule in titration.
I see.
And there's not a huge amount of golden rules. The golden rules just talk about the traffic from the agent to the titration cluster.
Okay. Are they configurable? I mean, as usual, those kind of things. Do we want to make them configurable? Can someone tweak them? Can they do anything with them?
Yeah, so in this case, this is one thing that you don't even have to configure in titration. It's actually going to be there by default, and there is nothing that you can change in the golden rules. They are always there. As soon as you enable enforcement on any workload, the golden rules will be placed onto that machine, and it will never be allowed to lock itself out from communicating with the titration cluster.
That's probably a better approach, I think.
That is a good approach to start with, right? So, we have our applications, we have our banking core prod, and we have global policies. And I can come and jump into my global policies, which we might want to begin with enabling first. I also am going to have a test machine that we are going to be looking at to analyze what sort of policies that we have loaded onto that test machine. So in our global policies here, it's quite a simple set. We just have DNS, we have access to the titration cluster, and we have the statistics collection. I will point out in particular this one here, we were just talking about those golden rules, allowing everyone inside our data center to speak to titration over port 443, 5640, and 5660. Now, this isn't actually necessary. It doesn't have to be here. It's always going to be captured by that golden rule, but why do you think it makes sense to have this policy here?
My guess, looking at it, the idea behind that is to make sure that we actually reflect what is on a server. And if we don't show them there, no one would actually know, wait, why the hell are those policies on a server?
Exactly. Those golden rules, they're always going to be there, but if we were looking at the policy analysis module, we were talking about escaped flows, permitted flows. If we didn't have a specific policy to permit those rules, we actually might start to see some escaped traffic in the titration cluster because we didn't understand that as a policy that should be there. So we always recommend as a best practice to make sure that you have a policy in place that says everyone can speak to titration.
Okay, so step 1 in deployment, in global policies, wherever you choose to put them, add those 3 rules.
Correct. What we have also done ahead of time is we have enabled the enforcement on this application workload. So we've configured the profile under agent configuration, and we will go into a lot more detail in the agent configuration module as to exactly what each one of these different features means, but we have enforcement enabled on our Acme workloads here.
Okay, so the only thing, maybe before we go further, could you just show us the default? What does the default look like, just to see which one you changed?
So the default set of policies is down here, and the default rules does not have enforcement enabled.
I see.
So you don't need to worry about the fact that as soon as you enable enforcement or add a sensor to the system, it's not going to start enforcing policies straight away. You have to explicitly go in and start enabling enforcement on the workloads that you are ready to enable enforcement on.
Cool. So step 1, add the 3 rules inside the policy. Step 2, go back, and step 1 is optional, right?
Yes.
But step 2, mandatory this one, make sure you hit edit, enable enforcement, and save.
Correct.
And make sure you watch the video module on the agent profile before you do that to understand how to apply them.
Correct. So let's go back to our workspace here, where we have our policies ready. We've been doing policy analysis for a while, and we are ready to enforce those application rules.
So you're in global policies?
Yes.
Okay.
We're going to start from the top down. Global policies first, then application-specific policies next.
Sounds good.
We also have a workload ready to look at. So here I am actually in a SSH connection into one of my banking web applications.
Okay.
Or I should say a node of my banking web tier. And I can actually look at the IP tables output to see what has been configured right now, so that we can compare it to what gets configured later.
Okay. Show us.
So if we execute that, we will see that there is not a huge amount in the IP table rules right now.
Actually, sorry, before you go further, what command did you use to see that on a server?
I executed IP tables dash capital L, then another dash, and then lowercase n and v.
Okay.
That's going to list all of the IP table rules, and it's going to list them without trying to resolve host names or resolve port IDs or port names, and it's also going to list them in a verbose mode so that I see everything that is useful to me.
I see. Sounds good.
So what we can see here is that already we have the golden rules enabled. So you can see that the communication to the titration cluster is not going to be locking ourselves out.
That's a blow your foot off protection.
Exactly.
I see.
And we can also see that there is a setting to accept traffic by default. Or in other words, we are running the firewall on this workload right now in a permit any mode.
Okay, so that's the input here and the output here. So first and third chain.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that leads us to the next point about how titration performs enforcement. Now you mentioned input and output. And that's because the firewall on a host operates in both directions. There are rules as traffic comes into that workload, and there were also rules as traffic leaves that workload.
Okay, I see. So directionality is important. Is directionality the same as state, or is it different?
So it is to do with the statefulness of the policy, and it's also to do with the fact that a flow from initiated by that workload is different than a flow that is received towards that workload.
Okay, so you manage, so state is managed through input and output, but also directionality is managed there. So I can have an outbound connection over one port, which denies inbound over that port.
You got
it.
So we have this ready now, and it's pretty much just in the accept any mode. And what we want to do is just ensure that we get those policies placed in that refer to the global set of rules.
Out of curiosity, if I don't enable enforcement, do I get those rules?
No.
Okay.
So you don't get these rules until you enable that flag in the software agent configuration.
Got it.
So if you're on a workload that you've installed the software agent and you're not seeing these particular rules show up, it's most likely because of the fact that you have not yet configured that agent to be enforcing policy. So go back to the software agent configuration and double check that you've actually enabled the software agent to be enforcing.
Cool.
So we can come back to our application here and to our global policies. And all we really need to do is say enforce policies.
Okay.
Sounds simple enough.
I wish we had the red button.
Yeah,
right
I wish
there.
it was red, but green is good enough to me. So we'll
Green
say enforce policies. It's going to ask us which version of the policies that we would like to implement. So in this case, we only have one, and that's okay because we haven't been playing around with this system very much. But if you wanted to roll back to a previous version of policies and you had multiple versions of policies, that would be possible for you as well.
So if I had P0, P2, P3, P4, I could just go and select in the list, whichever I want.
Okay. And if you associate any metadata with them, like a name or a description, you'll see those.
I think you need a change request ID there.
Yes, so we'll say CR1234, enable global policies. So we're going to do that. It is informing us that by clicking this, now we actually are starting to initiate true policy enforcement. So we will be changing the rules on that workload.
Okay.
So I'm going to click accept and enforce.
Just on the second part of this warning, right? I mean, this is the behavior by default, but it can actually be overridden, right? The part which says any existing rule will be deleted.
Yes, that's true. So we will touch on that more in the configuration of the agent module, but there is the capability to say, hey, look, I've already got some rules on this server and I don't want you to clobber those rules. It might be particularly important if you're using something like Kubernetes or you already have some IP table rules in place that you want to make sure don't get taken off of that workload. But the default behavior, as you mentioned, is to take control of the entire set of policies.
Sounds good.
So let's click accept and enforce. And now what it's going to do is pretty simple, right? It is going to take that set of policies. It's going to analyze which workloads it is going to affect, which is every single workload that sits inside this scope. So in that case, this is going to apply to everything that we've tagged inside the cloud scope.
Okay.
It's going to generate a unique set of policies per machine.
Per machine?
Yeah, per workload. It's not like there is a gigantic ACL that gets applied everywhere. That's not scalable. It doesn't make sense to apply policies on workloads that don't relate to that workload.
So if I have, so here is cloud. I could have cloud, could be AWS, could be Azure, could be my local cloud, for example. So if I were to enforce this policy here in cloud, that will enforce across AWS, Azure, and my local cloud, the COVH, because they're French. So if I have those enforced, that's what will render. But if I were to go one level farther down and I had cloud colon OVH and I hit enforce, that one would only enforce in the OVH scope.
You got it.
Perfect.
Okay.
So I can do small pieces validation if I want to.
Correct. But in this case, we've said these policies are so generic, they're so global, they should really affect every single workload. And so what we're going to do is come back to our workload screen here, and we can execute that same command. And now you can see that the output has grown. I'll do that one more time. Now we can see the output is now including some extra ports, 53, 53, and 8080. So that specifically relates to those global policies that we intended to be on that individual workload.
Pretty nice. And so the 80, I see 52 twice, but it's just because UDP and TCP.
Correct.
Okay.
So now we have those global policies loaded on that application workload. We still have the default rule, though, set to accept.
The default. Oh, you left a catch-all to allow?
That's correct. So if we look back at our policies here, because these are global policies and we don't want to enable a whitelist mode on every single workload in our environment, we've set the catch-all to allow. So that means that we haven't changed the state of that final rule there, and that's still accepting those packets by default. And we'll go in a few minutes to enable that individual applications policy, which is going to change that into a whitelist mode where it will say actually reject all packets by default.
Sounds good.
So we have that in place here.
That was easy, by the way.
That was very easy. And we'll be able to see on our enforcement screen here that it will have dropped a flag in place. So just like under the policy analysis, it shows you a flag when you enabled the policy analysis. It also is going to drop a flag to show when you enabled that policy enforcement.
And also if you disable, right?
And if you disable it as well, which is very important because you want to make sure if someone changed something, you know exactly who did change that particular policy. Not me, it must be you.
Sure.
So we have our global policies ready. We know that that workload is going to be able to reach the services it should be able to reach, and we can go ahead and enable that individual policies for that application.
Okay, let's go.
So let's switch application and come to the banking core prod.
So now, by the way, I just noticed analyze, enforce. So if you enforce, it's analyzed as well by default,
yes.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, and that's a very good point there. You can see that it has changed from the analyzed to the enforced tag there. So you can see that it's on a per workspace basis, and that really allows you to individually enable enforcement one by one rather than having to say enforce everything in one shot.
Good.
So I'm going to enable enforcement on my banking core prod application. That's not going to change anything to do with my shared service policies or my banking group policies.
Cool.
So let's go ahead and look at our banking core prod. We know that we've been doing policy analysis for some while now, and we know that that policy analysis is saying that the flows are being permitted and that we're comfortable with going ahead and enforcing this, particularly because this application is in catch-all deny.
That's the real deal.
This is the real deal here. This is now where we're saying any traffic that doesn't match this set of whitelist rules is going to be dropped.
If you mess up, Tim, you have to give your badge back.
Yeah, and I'll probably have to buy you a beer.
That's
So
only one.
we will work through this and we'll enable policy enforcement on this, and then we still have the capability to check that that is doing exactly what we expect it to do.
Sounds good.
So we just need to simply move over to our enforcement screen here. Again, you can see that in this workspace, it says the enforcement is disabled for the application.
That's good.
Yeah, but like we've seen, just because the application in specific has the enforcement disabled doesn't mean that the workloads that are part of that application are not being enforced. We've seen that the global policies are still already being enforced on that application workload, and you can see that by the particular text that's underneath that little banner there.
Could you pick one of the apps and just show us? Is there any policies there? Can you see that from the situation, by the way? Or do I need to log in?
That's a very good question. So we can actually check one of the individual workloads. I think we were looking at banking app, right?
Yeah.
So we can actually go to what we call the workload profile.
Okay.
And that workload profile is actually going to let us inspect what rules have been loaded on that machine or on that workload. So by navigating over to that and coming to my policies tab, we will see the policies that have been loaded onto this workload. So this is basically taking that same output, that IP tables output that we saw via the SSH session, and displaying it in a UI, which in many ways is easier to read and also shows you some statistics if you want. They're going to be just starting to show now as we enabled enforcement a few minutes ago.
Very cool. So if I understood right, use IP tables minus capital L dash VN and lowercase on the host. That needs root access. You may not have root access. So we actually thought that maybe an administrator might want to understand the policies so he can actually log in titration and get the same output without the root access.
You got it.
Perfect.
So we can see that there's 10 concrete policies loaded on this workload. And if we go and enable policy enforcement, which we will do in a few minutes, I'm expecting to see this grow slightly because there's going to be those individual application-specific policies.
Sounds good. By the way, just before you enforce, can I see details on any of those lines, or that's the maximum I have?
No, each one of these we can definitely open up. So for example, if I pick out this one, it's saying that I'm allowing anyone inside Acme to speak to titration. And in fact, if I pick one of them that actually has some traffic matching it, we'll see that it is starting to show a per rule statistic. So we know that there's a couple of thousand bytes going back and forth that are matching this individual rule.
Okay, so if I'm not a CLI geek like you, I can come in here, I can see the view, I can actually relate back directly to which policy we're talking about.
Correct.
I prefer this.
This one's nice, although I do happen to know that you are a CLI geek as well. And we can also see here that the final rule is in allow mode, any.
Okay, so that's my catch-all.
That's your catch-all, that's your backup plan, which we're about to take away as we go and enable that whitelisting.
You have your badge at hand?
You have little faith. So we'll come over to our applications again. We're going to switch to prod application, and we're going to say enforce. We're ready to do it. So let's click enforce policies. We can enforce the latest version of this policy, so you can see there's a couple of different versions, and we will select P4, and we'll say CR5678, and we'll say enforce banking. So we do that.
Okay.
Again, it's going to show us the same details, and we click accept and enforce. It is going to do the same as it was in the last section. So it's going to create an optimized set of policies on a per workload basis. But because these policies only apply to the scope banking core prod, it's going to affect a much smaller subset of workloads. We're not talking about the entire data center right now that we're enforcing these policies on. It is just the workloads that matter to that banking core application.
So that's the 10 workloads we see here.
Correct. And those 10 workloads are going to get a merged set of policies. They'll get the policies that came from the global workspace, and they'll also get the policies that came from this individual application workspace.
Okay.
So once we have done that, we're also going to see that the flag will be dropped down here. So the flag is going to be dropped at P4. We have a flag on a per workspace basis as well. So we could enable and disable this workspace. It wouldn't change what is happening on the global workspace. So you can track everything individually.
Sounds good.
It's also going to be updating what we see in that workload profile. So under that workload profile, we'll see those new rules coming in. And if we go to the workload in a second, we're also going to see those IP table rules update as well. So let's go ahead and switch over to that workload. And let's execute that same IP tables -L, capital L, -NV command. And we'll see that we're actually starting to put a few more policies in there. We might need to just wait a few more seconds for the final set of policies to get loaded. On average, it takes around 60 seconds from the point that you click enforce to the point that it's going to load every policy on every single individual workload.
Just to clarify that statement, so 60 seconds, whatever the number of workloads is. So it's not like 60 seconds because you have 10, and then 60 seconds, then 60 times 2 when you have 100, and then 6 times 4 when you have 200, etc., right?
No, it's a consistent SLA.
So like
in a lab, it might feel like you're waiting a little bit of time, but when you get to a production level size, and it still only takes 60 seconds to upload or update hundreds of thousands of ACLs across hundreds of thousands of workloads, you'll understand why it makes sense to have that consistent 60 seconds timer that you're dealing with.
You don't need to convince me.
Yeah. So we'll start to see some more ports come into this particular policy. In fact, we actually have this policy in place here now. We can see 443. Because that is who we're expecting to be speaking to. That is allowing us to be accessed from the outside because we are the web server.
We're looking at banking web, in fact.
Yes.
That's why, of course, 443 makes sense here.
Yeah. So this banking web server is saying that it is actually allowed to access or be accessed. And you can see here it's allowing new input connections to the banking web server.
I see. Pretty cool. What I like is well, I see each one of the lines has a policy ID next to it. So if I like geeking around or building software or whatever, I can actually match that if I don't want to use the UI to the actual policy inside Titration.
Yeah, that's right. So pretty much everything inside Titration you can access over the API. You can even access via that policy ID the individual policy and the individual statistics for that policy as well. So nothing is locked into the product at all.
Perfect.
And if we come back to our workload profile for that banking web server, and we pop over here.
The web server, right?
Oh, we were looking at web in this case, yeah. We'll come over to web. We'll say view workload. And then finally hit the policies tab. We'll see that it says 14 concrete policies, which is an increase from that original 10. So we can see that the campus is allowed to access us on port 443. So that is reflecting exactly what we saw in the IP table rules. And it's also allowing the banking app to be accessed by us as well. So we can see both the ingress policies and the egress policies for this individual workload.
I do notice also the catch-all has changed.
The catch-all changed as well. So we took the safety blanket away. We've gone right to whitelisting here. The final rule is drop. If there is no traffic that matches a particular rule, it is going to start hitting that drop. But because we went through the entire policy lifecycle, because we used ADM to automatically generate those policies based on a huge amount of accurate data, we ran through the policy analysis to ensure that those policies were going to be compliant and we weren't going to drop any traffic ahead of time. I'm actually very confident now that we've enabled that microsegmentation that we're not going to be dropping any packets at all.
Sounds good. I mean, there's quite an extensive testing happened before we did anything, right?
Yeah.
So, seems nice. Okay, I'll give you that. I still prefer the UI, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
But yeah, no, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So it really is about the more that you embrace the life cycle of policy, the more that you feel comfortable with the tooling available inside Titration to model that policy, to simulate that policy, and then finally get to the enforcement. It's actually going to be a very relaxed point in time where you go ahead and enable that enforcement. And what you can see here is that traffic has passed that P4 flag. What that means is now, once it's past that P4 flag, this is traffic that is being enforced live by Titration. And what we can see is the fact that there is 0 dropped packets. Every single packet is being handled by a whitelist rule, and we've basically enforced microsegmentation without breaking the application. That's the most important thing at the end of the day, right?
I mean, if you break the business, you're always in trouble.
Yeah, security has to make sure that it still doesn't end up breaking the business at the end of the day. So I'm very happy with that. We've got enforcement enabled on this application, including the global policies. We didn't break anything, which is always a good thing. And it was pretty simple, I felt.
I think so. Plus, I mean, you could see how the actual preparation work that could be done on daytime, so not on outside business hours, can actually be implemented very easily when you get to the point of enforcement. The skill set of the people who actually do the policy versus the people that implement can be totally different. There was no technical skill required in what you did to enable the policy enforcement. No access to the host neither, so you don't need to go through all the credential allocation and so on. So in my opinion, yeah, that's much better about it.
Yeah, this is a really big step forwards in how we can think about applying microsegmentation policies to applications.
Definitely.
Okay, well, that was really fun. I'm glad that we were able to get through to policy enforcement.
Definitely.
And I really appreciate you following through with us on that module. And if you would like some more information about how you can do policy enforcement with Titration, please go to cisco.com/go/Titration.